Silversoul did a video on being thick-skinned, as he put it, by which he means either having a good resistance to insult and kind of personal verbal attack, or on the contrary, being more vulnerable, being thin-skinned, I presume, being more affected by being insulted and so on. I guess I'm just thinking about this skin metaphor that's going on there, and that this skin can be either thick or thin. I don't think it just means thick. I think it means kind of tough and impermeable. It will be thick like an elephant's thing. Actually, like a rhinoceros's skin is thick. The idea being that it's some tough membrane that protects something that's fragile and vulnerable on the inside of it. It's very much a container model, I think, of what a person is. Broadly speaking, using the model of a body as the source of that metaphor. Now, there's a person coming here. Have they got a dog with them that my dogs are going to fight with? I think it'll be alright. Yeah, so it's basically using a kind of container model. A person has this container in which themselves inside of, and the body is conceived of as that container, which has got their self somehow inside of it. And the boundary between the body and the world, or the boundary between the self and the world, is conceived of as the skin. It's an extended metaphor. And so again, the logic of that is that this skin can be either tough or more fragile. It can be thick or it can be thin. It can allow attack and injury to come through it and to affect the fragile little morsel of the soul or whatever that's inside it, or not. It can protect it more effectively. Okay, but it is a metaphor, so I'm just wondering, is there what the implications of that metaphor, and is there an alternative, I suppose? I mean, the first thing to say, I guess, is that that's pretty much a classic metaphor. It's the one that Mark Johnson talks about at length in this really great book he wrote some years ago now called The Body and the Mind, which is all about metaphor and image schema. And just how, the embodiment, the fact that we have a body with all of these weird properties and sensory engagements and faculties and boundary surfaces like the skin, the fact that we have this is the major organising principle for our conceptual apparatus, including the conceptual apparatus of who we think we are, what we think it is to be a person. So when we think what it is to be a person, we kind of use body-based metaphors, and the skin is part of that metaphor, as I've said, and that's the thing that separates the person from the outside world. Okay, so thick, thin. So I got on a bit of a tangent there, but thick and thin skin is one way of looking at that. But given that it's a metaphor, isn't it more interesting perhaps to think about other ways of looking at that? Because you shouldn't be constrained by the metaphors that we just because we find them most familiar, just because they lurk in our language as cliches and aphorisms. So I'm thinking about this thick skin thing. As I say, thick just means tough, really, in the way that Silversoul is using it. Metaphorically tough as opposed to metaphorically really thick. But what would it be like to have a really thick skin? And by that I mean a skin that's at least yards, possibly miles thick. Is there a way of thinking of it in those terms? So that so here I am in this field in Cheshire. There's a bunch of people over there with a dog, and my own dogs are here. But rather than me being kind of locked inside this container, roughly coterminous with my own body, surrounded by this membrane of skin, I've got this really thick skin which just stretches out beyond me, and towards this, and there's barely anything inside it at all. It's just the skin starts at the core of my being and just stretches to the horizon, and that's how thick the skin is. But perhaps it's a variable density. So the layers of that skin which are closest to myself are quite densely packed, quite impermeable, and perhaps quite solid feeling. And as those probably an infinity of layers of skin moves out into the world, to get more and more fluid, perhaps, more and more spongy, yeah, more glutinous, perhaps. So as my skin moves out, the layers of skin which are perhaps out here, where my hand is, maybe a yard or so in front of me, my skin by that point is perhaps like a fluid, quite a thin fluid. Things can move around in it. Things can butt up against it. They don't hurt me. They're just kind of floating through my skin. And then further out still, my skin is even thinner. Perhaps it's almost gaseous. By the time it gets to those people with that dog over there, my skin is almost like a gas, which is just kind of roiling and turning and mixing with the outer layers of their skin and with the outer layers of the skin of their dog. When things are flying through our shared skin at that point, and sounds are echoing across our shared skin. So there's not this single boundary where I begin and where I end and the world begins, and then a gap before we hit this other boundary where someone else's self begins. There's just this big area of shared skin. Does that make any sense, or is that too weird? What do you think, Guy? Is that too weird?